Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou I tēnei ahi. I begin with karakia. Please join me if you know it. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana. He huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou ia tātou katoa. Homi e, hui e, tae ki e. May peace be widespread. May the seas be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day to show respect for each other and bind us together. Ko Helen Hedges tōku ingoa, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the final seminar in the University of Auckland Early Childhood Seminar Series for 2022, showcasing the work of early childhood academics and teachers. Our speaker today is Dr. Gloria Quinones from Monash University in Melbourne, who will present on compassionate pedagogies, a topic I'm sure will resonate with many of you. I've worked with Gloria before on a project in Vietnam and enjoyed her company at meetings and conferences, so it's really special to have her here with us today. Please use the Q&A function during the presentation to pose any questions you'd like Justine to ask at the end of the session. And then please use the chat function to connect with each other or to ask us any other questions. A recording of our seminar will be available after the webinar on our YouTube channel for you to promote with your colleagues. And now I'll hand over to Justine to introduce Gloria in a bit more detail. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Helen. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter this evening, Dr. Gloria Quinones. Although she now lives in Australia with her family, Dr. Quinones was born in Monterrey, which is the third largest city in Mexico, I've learned, where she began her career as an early childhood teacher. Dr. Quinones is now a senior lecturer in the School of Educational Psychology and Counselling in the Faculty of Education at Monash University in Australia. Gloria's research focuses on early childhood education, specifically conceptualizing infant-toddler affective and compassionate pedagogies, emotions and well-being of children and educators. Dr. Quinones has a substantial portfolio of research publications, including a new co-authored book on effective early childhood pedagogy for infant toddlers. She researches and writes with a range of international colleagues, including Helen and Maria Cooper from the University of Auckland, and has very recently returned from a conference in Norway where she got to experience the Northern Lights. In this evening's presentation, Dr. Quinones will be drawing on understandings of compassion as involving acts of showing affection, helping and alleviating other people's suffering, and being embedded in social relationships and everyday practices in early childhood settings. Compassionately supporting children during emotionally intense experiences is a familiar practice for early childhood teachers, and we look forward to hearing from Gloria about how compassionate pedagogies were practiced by teachers in two different cultural contexts, a Mexican and an early childhood setting, in response to emotionally intense situations experienced by children. Tēnā koe, Dr. Quinones, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Welcome, Dr. Quinones, and thank you for sharing with us this evening.
Thank you, Justine and Helen, for the very warm welcome. And if you have any comments, happy to see them in the chat, but I think I don't get to see you, so thank you so much. And today I will be talking about my research on compassionate pedagogies for children's emotionally intense experiences. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I speak on today and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. And I would like to specifically acknowledge where I live here in Wurundjeri and the Kulin Nations, so the Wurundjeri and Bungarong people, communities of the Kulin Nations where I live here in Australia. They are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands and where I live. And I pay my respects through my research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Bungarong elders and their past, present, future communities and emerging elders as well, And I also acknowledge if you are in Indigenous lands as well. So thank you so much for being here today. So throughout the next, I think 45 minutes, I will talk about compassion. And I wanted to start with some questions today for you to think while I'm presenting, and come back to these questions at the end. So thinking about why is compassion important in early childhood education and care, or ECEC, and why should we consider compassion as a pedagogical approach? So why is it? Why is it important? Why is it a topic that really deserves our attention? How do we recognize children's these emotional intense experiences, and how do we act with compassion? And I will be talking about these from my experiences in Australia and my experiences being back home where I am in Mexico. So keep those questions while I speak to you today. Now, when I was looking at some pictures in the internet around, how to represent what compassion is, I could see that we could find lots of hands holding together and like a helping hand. And I really like this quote from Taggart, and he talks about how human activities, compassion is in human activities, and which we will describe as compassionate are those who seek to alleviate suffering, vulnerability, or inequality in a public sphere. And what you will see today is the way that we think about alleviating suffering is also related to how we have also experienced suffering or pain. So that's really important. And that's why compassion and emotions go in hand together. So this is how this concept of compassion is explained. Also, in my collaborations with my colleagues from Helsinki, Hilppö and Professor Lipponen and Anuka Pursi, they talk about in the research on compassion and cultures of compassion, they talk about how compassion is cultural and contextual specific. So we have to think about it in terms of where we are at now and how compassion is constructed in different cultural communities, and how also context and the space and time is really important when we think about compassion. So compassion, and this is what Jacob Hilppö talks about, compassion is not an inherent human characteristic, but in terms of situated actions and interactions that are framed and constituted in and through the history and culture of a specific institutions. So what different from Taggart that talks about that it's in all human activities, Hilppö offers another perspective of compassion, that we act compassionately in specific interactions, and we also have ways of acting compassionate. So while I say this, what are the compassionate actions is really important for us to think in the context that we work, but also that the history of those institutions, those early childhood centers, or even in a family context, they do have history and culture. And when I mean history and culture is that they're specific in time and space. And culture, the culture of institutions have cultures as well. So we have to think about how do we enact individually and collectively these compassionate acts. So that's really important when we think about compassion. And I will be showing you some examples around that. Okay, next slide. So with my colleagues in Finland, they talk about how there are cultures of compassion. So again, thinking about those culture of compassions that are contextual, institutional specific, we have a culture as well as being, we're not removed of an institution, we're not removed from a family. We bring all those experiences on how we act compassionately. So this involves responding to someone's suffering in the moment. So thinking about how sometimes when we're in these really emotionally charged, intense situations, think about how in your everyday interactions you act. And these might be different or similar when you're in a family context, but it might be different when you're working in a professional context. So thinking about how do we respond to someone's suffering in the moment. Also the practical wisdom. So we all bring wisdom into our interactions. It's this accumulated knowledge that we bring to this practical wisdom as a professional competence, as something that we know of EC educators or early childhood educators, how we are sensitive to situations that involve complexity. And if you think about that, I was just reading in LinkedIn, and maybe this is a commercial, but I was thinking of someone is doing, don't remember the name of the author, doing compassion in higher education. And my research is in compassion in early childhood context, but thinking about how workplaces as academics, how do we enact compassion in this context? How do you enact compassion with family? And how do you enact compassion with your colleagues, with children, with families? So that involves competence. So in thinking about professional competence, we also need to teach compassion to our pre-service teachers. Acts of compassion are also help alleviate someone's suffering. So that's also really important to think about. What are our acts of compassion? In our research with my colleague, Maria Cooper, we also found that why is compassion an integral practice in early childhood education and care? Compassion is an ethical disposition in how we care for children. It's an ethical disposition because it brings ethical choices and decisions of how we act. And again, always thinking about the rights of children that's of course really important. Compassion also in our compassionate pedagogies or arts, it also improves the quality of relationships. So this includes our ability to recognize how we act and care for others. And this is also something a professional disposition, as I mentioned before. Adults, we are role models. We already know that, but adults demonstrate to children how to act compassionately to children by helping, caring, or consoling others. And remembering that compassion is about alleviating pain and suffering. And employing and extending to this, employing compassionate practices or pedagogies during emotionally intense situations. And I'll talk about those emotionally intense situations. So in my PhD, 2013, when I graduated, I explored this concept of emotionally intense experience, or this Vygotskian concept of pereshivani. And you can go and look, there's a lot of research in this, with this concept. But in synthesis, this is a quote from Vygotsky himself. The emotional experience, or pereshivani, arising from any situation or from any aspect of the environment determines what kind of influence this situation or this environment will have on the child. So again, An emotionally intense experience is not an individual endeavor. It's a situational, it has again a context, a cultural situation, and it also has an influence on the child. So that's really important for us to think about that, that the environment is social, is physical, is atmospheric, and there are many influences that the environment has on the child's emotionally experience. Now, the emotional experience of, or again, pedagogy, and I put these little bubbles to mean that it is the social environment. So if we think about environment, it's social, so it involves relationships, interactions, and it's a source for the child to develop and learn. So the environment always has an influence in children. It's also, this emotionally intense experience, it can be also dramatic events in the lives of children. And this could be events that repeat itself, that are experienced several times, or that they're momentarily. So again, this can be something that we need to identify. What could be this dramatic event in the child's life? So I'm thinking of what I'm going to talk next, of this transitioning to the center, and that becomes also a dramatic event for children separating from parents. And what is important here, so this third bubble, is how the child is aware and understands the situation and is making an interpretation and is emotionally relating to this dramatic event. So we know that older children or younger children, infants and toddlers, they communicate differently, but they're effective communicators. So we have to understand how we also read these events, how the children is emotionally relating to these events. So I'm going to talk about two published research. So the first one was, it's an infant toddler per-service teacher and her compassionate pedagogy. So this project was in Australia, and this publication is available. So I wrote this with my colleague and friend Maria Cooper, and this was about mentoring practices in the infant and toddler per-service teachers. And the question in this paper is, what are these institutional conditions? Remember, again, compassion has some institutional cultural conditions as well. And how is this per-service teacher experiencing with a child this emotionally intense experience, and how she's acting these compassionate pedagogical practices? So that's one. The second one is to do with peer interactions and the teacher's compassionate practices in Mexico. So this comes from my PhD, and I also wrote, I didn't put the link there, but I also wrote these with, I exchanged ideas with my colleagues in Finland, Professor Lipponen and Pursi. So this was about understanding the emotional experience of children living in a rural community in Mexico. So in this, I'm going to discuss what are the culturally situated manifestations of everyday grief and grieving in children's everyday life. So in this research, I'm extending emotions, or we are extending the idea of emotions into this concept that I'm working out at the moment, that is grief and grieving. So I'm working with these ideas with my colleagues Lipponen and Pursi in Finland. So we're working with this idea of grief and grieving. So the first one. So this is the infant toddler per-service teacher and the compassionate pedagogies in Australia. And you have the link there that you can look at. The paper is currently published. So how did we went about with this data analysis? What was the data? How did we analyze this? So this was a wider project that included 4 per-service teachers, their supervising educators or mentors, and children. So that's infant and toddlers. There was a total of 24 hours of video observations, and this was about everyday practices, and the focus was the pre-service teachers. We visited these 4 pre-service teachers 2 times for 2 hours, and it was in the first week and 3rd week of professional experience. And at that time, here in Australia, international pre-service teachers and domestic pre-service teachers undertook a 3-week infant toddler professional experience. So there wasn't much research at that time around the infant and toddler professional experience. So that was the focus, really looking at them. Now, in this paper, we really wanted to provide a holistic view of the emotional experience of these pre-service teachers and focus child that I'm going to talk. So this was Yuri, and the toddler was Millie. And we use this wholeness approach, which is Hedegaard's approach, to look at these emotionally intense experience and these compassionate approaches from a holistic approach. So a holistic approach in the sense that we look at the Australian society, so the societal perspective, the institution, where the institutional practices, where the pre-service teacher was undertaking the professional experience, and the personal, so that pre-service teacher's experience. And these allowed us to unravel these compassionate pedagogies and the flow of how this emotionally experience was acted, I guess, or was happening at that moment in time. So we really look at these 3 perspectives of the society, the director's views, and some of the curriculum documents, the institutional an everyday event between the pre-service teacher and the focus child, and again, the personal. So I wanted to start with this before I went to the situation that I was focusing. So the director discussed, we focus on the data showed a child, Millie, that was really struggling, that was very distressed in a situation where she was transitioning from the parent to the center, and she was really crying and distressed. And I showed this video to the director to get her perspective around what was happening in her center. And she was saying, well, our role is to help children understand the experience. That is the bit we are missing. It seems that it's an expected practice when they separate from a parent. They are expected to cry, and because of that expectation, they are going to cry. We don't deal with it, and we just accept it, and that's not the role of supporting the child's emotional well-being. Crying is our strongest emotion. We have to hear, we have to listen. I do not think we listen to children's emotions. We accept them, except I don't think, and they shouldn't be the norm. I really want to model that I can see you're sad because your mom left, but I can also see what is happening with your body. Will something help you? Do you need a cuddle? Because sometimes this will help you feel better, and then we can talk about the things that will help you feel better. So again, this is the institutional perspective of how this situation is seen from the director's perspective. That crying is a very strong emotion. We see it straight away. When you come to a center, you see it. And then how are we going to alleviate these? How are we going to support and help the child? So this is a bit of the situation that I showed to the director, and this is Yuri, the pre-service teacher, and this is Millie. So Rita, the supervising mentor, passes the hand to Yuri, who holds her hand. Rita, the supervising teacher, leaves her, and Millie turns to Rita as if wanting to follow her. So you can see that in the first picture, Millie is looking back at Rita. So that's the first figure. and she really wants to go back to the supervising mentor. However, Yuri attempts to stop Millie because, of course, the mentor or the supervising teacher hands Millie, so now she has to take care of her. And Yuri asks, you want a ball? Millie continues to hold Yuri's hand and very persisting holds her hand. She doesn't let go. So Yuri comments, I can hold your hands all the time, darling. And Millie starts crying. Yuri really tries to distract her a lot of the time. Yuri also walks to the playground with Millie. Millie makes a wailing sound. Yuri kneels. You need to go to yourself inside. Where do you want to go? So Millie pulls her hand a lot to go inside. At that moment, they're in the playground. And again, Yuri kneels and says, let go of Millie's hand. You want to go inside to the classroom to play? So Millie takes Yuri's hands and they go closer to the classroom. And then in figure 3, you can see how Millie, well, that's in figure 2, pulling Yuri classroom. Eventually, they walk back to the classroom and Millie begins to cry again. And really Yuri struggling with Millie because it goes, the crying goes up and down. So crying and not crying. Eventually they stay, if you can see in figure 3, they stay in the classroom for a bit. The mentor teacher at the background is welcoming other children, and you can see a parent there as well. So it's a busy time in the center because children are arriving and they're getting into the everyday routines. So eventually a lot of things happened. Yuri takes her outside, tries to engage her with a group of children, then comes back. And then there is a water table, which initially Yuri was helping out before Millie came. So Yuri moves outside and again joins the group of children. Then she works with Millie as she joins in to help 2 teachers because a glass breaks inside the water table container. And Yuri moves to help other children. She takes her hand away from Millie and Millie cries. She really cries intensely for 1 minute, sobbing, wailing, really distressed. Then she stops when Yuri holds her hand again, and then her cry increases when Yuri helps her mentor teacher for a minute. Yuri says to Millie, darling, darling, as Yuri moves away from Millie to help the teacher. Millie continues and cries 2 minutes. So she cries a lot, then she stops and then goes back again and she cries. Eventually, Yuri brings Millie back to the classroom, and Rita, the supervising or mentoring teacher, helps Millie to settle down a bit. And this happens for 25 minutes, all this, so I have contained it a bit. So this was definitely a very emotionally intense experience. And thinking about this wholeness approach, we look at the Millie's perspective and Yuri's perspective. So in our analysis, we can see that Millie is really communicating this distress, this really intense experience. Millie, there is a collective manifestation of Millie's emotion to which Yuri is responding, holding Millie's hands. Millie is also expressing these true emotions in this situation. She's crying and she somehow is being supported by Yuri. Millie really demands that Yuri holds her hand and becomes available to her. And it's a bit of a ethical decision somehow and contradictions because Yuri holds her hands and then she tells her, I'm not sure if I can hold you all the time. Yuri cooperates with her mentor teacher to emotionally support Millie's difficult transition. And Yuri effectively encourages. She is warm. She encourages as well, smiling. She gives close eye contact. And verbally, she tells a lot of, oh, it's okay. And yes, I'll take you. So she is very supportive and compassionate as well. This emotional experience, as you can see, well, there's a lot of nonverbal and gestural persistence by Millie. She's very persistent. And this is that's of course that we don't know, we cannot read we can read her body, but we don't know what Millie might be thinking, but we can read her embodiment, her body. This nonverbal and pointing and gestural persistence is quite evident with Millie being a toddler. This is how she's really being aware and interpreting the situation. She knows that pointing back is going to take her back to the classroom. So she shows this to Yuri. So how do we see compassionate pedagogies in this emotionally intense situation? So how do we really see this? Well, there are intuitive responses. So they're not really established. Yuri, we can see she's not sure what to do. She's almost crying for compassion herself from her supervising mentors. She's reading and sensing the emotional experience and the situation using her own knowledge of how to respond with compassion. Now, if you think about you being an adult, really distressed, crying a lot, and people keep telling you things verbally, sometimes some adults don't even respond to the verbal. So sometimes the verbal might not help, but the holding hands do help. So thinking about how as adults, how do we respond to something that is very emotionally distressed, that you cannot think that you're crying for help. Now, Yuri, the per-service teacher, is comforting, using comforting touch. And I have shown this video even to my per-service teachers, my students at Monash, and they keep saying, well, is she really comforting Millie? Well, yes, she's holding her hands and it helps her because she brings her into the classroom. So Millie is doing a lot, and Yuri as well. Holding hands is deliberate and again intuitive, and it's also a form of embodying compassion. So it's an embodied resource that is important to soothe the crying of Millie, because Millie cries and then stops, and then cries and then stops, but always holding the hand of Yuri. Now, there's also some in the comforting touch, there is physical avoidance, because Millie clearly says, I can't hold your hands all the time, darling. And when she tries to do that, that's when the heighten of the emotion goes at the end with the water table. She's really, really crying, needing the attention. So there's a bit of contradiction as well in her compassionate approach. So in the discussion, we talk about how understanding infants and toddlers' rights to competent, compassionate teachers when moments of distress arise is vital. And per-service teachers who are situated within a community of mentors also need to be taught this right. We wonder what is going on as well with Yuri, per-service teacher Yuri. And in the paper, we discuss a bit more what she's saying. And she really has some conversations with her mentors where she really brings this example. And well, we think we might not know if this is the example in the whole professional experience, but she really says that she really struggles with children that are crying, that are really in those emotionally intense situations. She doesn't know what to do. So it's not only about herself, but also how mentors support them, and how also us in higher education can have reflective discussions about how we deal with distress. How can we be compassionate? However, for this right to be upheld, support in situ, collaborative reflective dialogues about showing and modeling care and compassion are needed for effective and affective, I will add, pedagogy and mentoring of per-service teachers. So that's for us to discuss a bit further in this when I finish, for us to think out more about how do we deal with these situations? What is our compassionate approach? Because Yuri did try to be compassionate and towards Millie. Okay, so that's the first in the Australian context. The second one is compassionate practices with peer interaction, so children's peer interaction. So here we have older children, 4 and 5-year-olds in Mexico, and a teacher really trying to also be compassionate. And this teacher, and I should say this teacher Leo, was almost like a preservist teacher, because teacher Leo was 17 years old and didn't have any educational qualifications. So Leo went like a community service to this rural community. And if Leo stayed for 1 year in this CONAFE kindergarten, it's called, so it's CONAFE, CONAFE kindergarten, he will get a scholarship if he stayed 1 year in this community. But that's another presentation, and you can read more around that. But yes, teacher Leo was also very young in terms of experience with children. So again, this is also very intuitive what teacher Leo is doing. So the data analysis, the video observations were made. So the focus was Mayra, who is 5 years old. There were 5 visits to the family home with 9 hours of data in the family setting. And there were 28 hours of data in the kindergarten. So this is, again, following the wholeness approach, looking at the child from a whole approach. I was doing visits in the family setting and in the kindergarten to really look at the learning and development and the everyday life of Mayra across the family and the kindergartens. And I was living in this community for around 3 weeks. So I could also see Mayra in the community informally, riding her bike, walking to the store. So it was very ethnographic approach. This paper aims to expand Mayra's emotionally experience. So again, bringing that concept of Pereshivani. My whole thesis was about this concept through a wholeness approach, and extending emotions. So naming emotions is really important as well for us as researchers, for children. Naming the emotions was really important. So in this aspect, in this paper, and the concept that I'm working, as I mentioned before, now is this concept of grief and grieving. So in this paper, we discuss this grief and grieving as Mayra feeling lonely and withdraw from playing with peers, and having at home a 10-year-old in my house. And I can really see that children do experience a lot withdrawing from playing with peers and this sense of loneliness. So that I extend this idea of grief and grieving in this into Mayra's emotionally experience. So in the first project, it was about the emotional experience, this distress situation. And now here I talk about the naming this emotion of Mayra. And you can agree or disagree with me, so that will be interesting as well. But again, it's an intense, it's a charged experience. Teacher Leo, who I explained before, is using a compassionate approach to alleviating Mayra's grief in a peer situation. So they are playing a game. Again, I use very much a Hedegaard's approach, and this is this wholeness approach for analysis. So this includes, as I mentioned before, acknowledging the family and the teacher's perspective. So I do talk about how this is really important in this wholeness approach. So let me introduce you to Mayra. Oh no, where is Mayra? Okay, Mayra is a bit later, but I'll talk about Mayra. So as I mentioned before, Hilppö and Percy have also recently published a paper on these children's everyday grief and grieving in Mind, Culture and Activity. I think I have not included it in the references, but you can email me if you want that reference. And this is Quinones, which is me, in our conceptualization. So Hilppö and Percy and I are working. We have a cross-cultural project. So I'm doing this project currently in Australia. I'm gathering data as I speak with infants. And Hilppö and Percy are doing this project in Helsinki. So it's about children's everyday grief and grieving. And what we have found out is that grief, we think about grief from the perspective of someone dying. And we think about it from a medical approach. So when we think about this concept of grief and grieving is someone dies and we are living this process of grieving. Again, if we think about the role of culture, many different cultures have different ways of grieving and experiencing grief and grieving. So this project is really expanding our conceptualization of what does it mean in different cultural communities to grieve and grieve. So grief is considered as an umbrella concept for various emotionally experienced, in this case, loneliness and withdrawal. But it can also be, in my research at the moment with infants, I can see is also about missing a sibling, missing a parent. And again, we want to extend this umbrella of emotions to grief, to this everyday grief, not only the grief of someone dying, but the everydayness of grief. For example, I experienced that, as Justin mentioned before. I went to a conference in Norway and I was away for 2 weeks, and I was really missing and grieving this, not being able to see my family, not being able to physically be present in important events, for example, even so much that I was in touch with them. I experienced this everyday grief and grieving. So these the perspectives of children in the sense of this everyday grief and grieving, they have been paid little attention from this perspective. And we call them, maybe we call them different things. We call them children transitioning to the center. We might call them children emotion separation anxiety, for example, if we think about attachment theory. So we name them many different ways. So we're bringing a contemporary perspective into this everyday grief and grieving. So grief involves some degree of suffering. It could be being excluded from play activities. It could be missing a parent. It could be someone hurting us in the playground. So it could be moment, as I said before, it could be in the moment, or it could be as reliving it in different moments of time. So we're looking at it also in a more, not only on little moments, but in our research, we are looking at in a longitudinal way. So this research that we're currently undertaking, we're doing it 6 months. So we're looking at different children for 6 months. In this paper, we extend the emotional situations or these emotionally intense experiences beyond the death of loved ones as mundane and ubiquitous. I cannot even say that word. It's so academic, or ubiquitous aspect of children's lives. So it's really everyday. So we want to explain these as this is something everyday. So everyday examples of children grief and grieving, including the loneliness, for example, associated to not having friends, which friends is in the radar of children. There, it's really important. And this is an aspect that I'm really interested in my research as well. Transitioning from home to the early childhood setting, being separated from parents or guardians, or suffering from illness as well, not being able to come to the center because of being ill, for example. So we want to see many different situations where children are experiencing everyday grief and grieving. And I'm sorry I'm spending a bit of time here, but I really want you to grasp that concept of what it means, this everyday grief and grieving, and for you to think about currently in your work or in your family life, what are those everyday grief and grieving experiences that are painful, and we want to see how the children, we recognize them, we know we have them, but we move on, and we can continue, and in that moving on from that grief and grieving, we need compassionate approaches, we need affective pedagogies as well. So I'll talk a bit more about that. So this is in the world of Maida, who is 5 years old. She was really experiencing grief. And I couldn't see this when I was doing my PhD, but I could see it now in the sense of, in the sense that I could understand Maida better after a few years later of doing my PhD. And going back through the data, Gina's mother, so Gina, I had conversations with her, and she said to me, oh dear, she was worrying, they're going to kick her at school. Sometimes Maida cried because she wanted to go and play with Greta's girls, but those girls always kick her. So Greta's girl is, are girls that are one in a specific, Anna, who you will see later on, that was in the kindergarten. So because it was a small community, there were not a lot of children to play with. It was a really small community. So there was, and Maida was a bit of an outsider because Maida's mom lived in the city and then came to the rural community. So she was not actually, there were a lot of more complexities around that. So she says, so I tell Maida, there are no girls, play by yourself. And she plays by herself. And then Maida responds, I play by myself. And then Gina, the mother, states, yeah, she stays here. I don't like them to kick her. So obviously this was a bit of a something that they were experiencing, this loneliness. So both Maida's and Gina's perspective had this sense of loss, and it was not only this conversation. There was a lot of these as well. Maida and Gina's perspective had this sense of loss and the opportunity to play with others and playing by herself. So Gina's perspective, the mother, was really important in how she was perceiving this social situation. And Justin, just please let me know in the chat how I'm going with time. Thank you. So this was also part of Gina's, the mother's grief and grieving of how her child didn't have friends and was lonely and there was this emotionally hurt with like kicking her, being emotionally hurt by peers, also leading to loneliness. So we bring that aspect of the family, of this sense of grief and grieving, to this next situation. So in the paper, we talk about this game of dice. So this situation. Okay, thank you. So this game of dice. So there's as you can see in the second photo, there's not a lot of, this was a rural community, so not a lot of resources. They were low income community, we will say in Western countries, I guess, low income. So really few resources. So the teacher had these dice and she had to be very creative how he played with the dice. So teacher Leo, who is in the green pants, passing the dice to Anna. So that's Anna in the red pants. Then we have Mario in the gray shirt, and then Mayra is next to Mario. So the teacher Leo invites the children to play a dice game, and Mario and Anna are very keen to play. The teacher rolls the dice as the children sit, and then Leo gives the dice to Anna. Leo explains the rules of the game to children. So this was not about playing with the dice and rolling the dice. This was about hiding the dice. So Leo explains the rules of the game to the children that they cannot see as he hides the dice. So it was a bit of hide and seek the dice. The teacher says ready when the dice is hidden. Children run to look for the dice. Mayra finds the dice and shows it to everyone and then throws it to Leo, as you can see in the second figure. This happened several times. Actually, Mayra really liked this idea of playing because she found the dice, I think, twice, and then Mario finds it once. However, the game changes and eventually resulting in children losing interest in the game and they really not wanting to play together. Leo asked children who wants to hide the dice. Mayra shows an interest in hiding the dice and he wants to hide it quickly, but the teacher stops him because Anna and Mayra have not closed their eyes, so the rules. And once Anna and Mayra are ready, sorry. They run and find it, but Mario retrieves it first. So Mario has the dice, and this is the game we used to throw it to the teacher Leo. So teacher Leo hides the dice. So he always kept saying, you know, are you ready? And Anna this time finds the dice and hides it. So this happens several times. Eventually, Mayra loses the interest and indicates that she no longer wants to play and walks slowly, and Leo physically encourages her to continue playing. So this he really grabs her to play. Anna hides the dice in a bucket and Mario asks if she's ready. So Mario and Anna want to play. And this is a small group, remember, this is a rural community, so it's there are 4 children in the kindergarten, but 3 playing at the moment. So anyway, so it continues this game, and eventually Mayra plays with them. Maria is on her knees and tries to take the dice from the bucket. Mario is holding it. Leo tells Mario to give it to Mayra. Mario throws the dice to Mayra, but she cannot catch it because her hands are on the floor. So an accident happens. It hits her face, and so she then, you can see, very dramatic, she puts her face down and she begins to cry, and that's when teacher Leo begins to hold her. So Anna and Mario check with Mayra if she's okay, and she starts to cry. So Mario mentions that he did not see Mayra and he's actually really concerned. I didn't see her. It was an accident, he begins to say. Leo approaches Mayra and leans in to hug her, and you can see the holding position the teacher Leo is doing. And he's asking her, where did he hit you? Are you okay? Where does it hurt? So really focusing on, you know, where did he hit you to Mario? So Mario really feels, you can see him that he feels really bad. Leo consoles Mayra, asking if she's okay. She doesn't answer and she continues sobbing. Leo asks if it hurts her and touches her forehead. Anna and Mario look outside the window while teacher Leo consoles Mayra. So the teachers and peer compassions, and how do we see this grief? It is really emotional pain, not just because of the situation. Apart from Maida not being that interested at the end, because she's actually not winning, she's losing interest. She's not winning. She brings the grief because she's actually feeling that loneliness as well, because she's bringing that larger grief. But she's also withdrawing from that situation. And this is something, looking at the data, there are a lot of examples where she is withdrawing from playing. So I have seen this throughout a lot of my data with Maida. So this is a strategy that she's using, withdrawing. And children in peer situations, they tend to do this. So, of course, we can see Leo alleviating Maida's grief. This grief as withdrawing in this situation from the play. She's being hurt, of course, feeling that emotionally pain. You can see that he has a comforting embrace, closely, affectionately bodily contact. He's verbally questioning, directed to the peer hitting Mario rather than the dice or the situation. With the peers, well, Mario actually does show a verbal, compassionate concern towards Maida. He asks, "Are you okay, Maida?" There is a bit of a missed opportunity to extend the dialogue with Mario from the teacher. The teacher really focuses on what is happening to Maida and did he, he hit you, really making Mario responsible to what is happening. However, there's another side of it where Mario and Anna don't push it. They provide a space for grief and grieving. So they kind of actually remove themselves from the situation and begin to look out of the window. So they give a bit of a time and space for the grief to happen. So in conclusion, getting to the end, it's an in conclusion, I feel, not a conclusion. You can see that both Yuri and Leo, they do have an intuitive and compassionate response that requires a deeper reflection in relation to culture. The culture, and I didn't say this, but Yuri is an international pre-service teacher, so she's from China. And we have this teacher, Leo, who is from, a different cultural context. So considering crying, because we can see both the toddler Millie and Maida crying, how we give how there are different perspectives and interpretations for this situation. Crying as part of that distress, grief, emotional, intense situation, how do we culturally accept it, and how we also normalize, and how do we bring a compassionate approach to it? We really, a compassionate approach is really safeguarding the well-being of both Yuri and Millie. So compassionate practices, we really need to think more about paying more attention to these emotionally intense experiences or situations. In the first example, Millie and Yuri needed to receive care and compassion, I think, from mentor teachers, and also to provide this care to self and others in the early learning center. So much is needed as well here. Grief is manifested through the human body. We see it embody it. Both Millie and Maida don't verbally express how they're feeling, but we can see, because sometimes, as I said much before, because the situation is so intense, they cannot verbally say something. They express it through the body. So embodied actions such as crying, loss, suffering, frustration exist also in both temporal and spatial context. Also important is to understand how peers are supported by teachers in the right to express compassion to others, such as Mario, acknowledging peers' emotional distress. So other children, how do they act upon the distress of others? And in this case with Maida, the reasons for withdrawing from the game. and providing, as we all know, a safe space for children to express their emotional distress is very important. So those are some thoughts from these two research studies that I have undertaken. So I think I'm finished. This is it. And you can read more about these in these two publications with my colleagues, Maria Cooper, Lasse Lipponen, and Nuka Porsi and Melissa Barnes, and continue conversations as well of grief and grieving in early childhood education. And I would like to thank you to my co-authors and the teachers, students, and families who participated in both the Mexican and the Australian study. And these are some of the references. And thank you, thank you so much for listening. That's my email and my Twitter account. So thank you so much. I think I'm within time for some discussion. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Gloria. That has been wonderful and so interesting to hear about those emotionally intense experiences, because I know that they're very familiar ones to early childhood teachers. And it was really interesting to consider those experiences from a range of perspectives. We are going to be a little bit tight for time, but we do have a few questions that people would like to ask. And the first one is a thank you from our friend and colleague Maria Cooper, who says, thank you for encouraging us to think about the child's emotional experiences from a range of perspectives. What are your thoughts on responding to any pushback from some mentor teachers, centre directors, or even families regarding teachers getting too close or overly affectionate with children?
Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. Thank you, Maria, for that question. Again, I think it's all about what is expected in the community. So I think as an educator or a teacher, you know your communities really well. So I think it depends. There are some families that they want you to be close to children, and being part of being a teacher, and even with younger children, you do become affectionate with children, in the sense of affection can be with words and attitude. It's not only about showing it physically. And I think that's where we get confused, that we have to give them hugs all the time. Sometimes an affectionate touch, as I mentioned before with Yuri, or holding hands, that helps children. And I think it's all about balance and what is culturally accepted. But I think you can be close and affectionate without being physically affectionate as well. Like I can be with you affectionate and warm with how I talk to you and how I listen to you and how I speak to you. So I think maybe we need to explore more that. So I hope that's a good answer to your question, Maria.
I think that was a great answer, and you're so right that it does depend so much on the context that we're teaching in and the individual children that we're with. And for some children, they will really seek out that physical contact, whereas for other children, they don't actually want that from us necessarily, but to know that we're there and present, and fully present with them. And we can also be physically present to children without actually being emotionally present and available to them. So, and I think children also pick up on that. Yes. From us.
And we saw in the examples different ways of really being affectionate. And with teacher Leo, he actually was, even holding Mayra to get into, like, that was culturally accepted. And I think being Mexican and the Latin American communities were very touchy. So that's culturally accepted, right? Maybe some people might disagree, but we kiss, we hug, and but it's also about knowing children also tell us that they don't want to be touched or kissed, like they will tell us as well. So we also have to listen, even if we're a culture where that might be common. You know, some children don't want to do it, but then again, some children are they're familiar and they're used to it because they live in that context as well. So again, it's consent. Body consent is really important, and you can see it with, you know, children, how they express it. They you know, I guess we have to be very aware of reading children's body. I think that's a lesson, that they communicate with their body, and that's what is happening in these situations.
And I think that's the compassionate response, really, isn't it? When we are actually attuned to them and giving them what they need in those moments, and what they're telling us they're needing as well.
Yeah.
I really hate to end this conversation, because I know that there are so many more things that we could talk about and that I would really like to be able to talk about. But we also know that a lot of our people who are watching right now have things to go home to and dinner to cook and all of those sorts of things. But tēnā koe, Gloria, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for this opportunity to discuss with you. And I'm really pleased that you've shared your email address and your Twitter handle. And I can say that following you on Twitter is definitely an interesting thing to do. You even get to see the Northern Lights. And for anyone who is interested in reading more about Gloria's work, I really highly recommend her co-authored book, Affective Early Childhood Pedagogy for Infant Toddlers. And as I said, you can follow Gloria on Twitter to stay up to date with her work. And you can find that on the flyer for the seminar as well, Gloria's Twitter handle, and we'll also put it up with our notes on our YouTube recording.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for advertising the book. I actually didn't talk much about the book, but yes, do read it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will now pass back to Helen to close our session. So kia ora, Helen.
Kia ora, Justine. Kia ora koutou. Yeah, what a fascinating and compelling seminar. Thank you so much, Gloria. You really prompted us to think quite deeply about children's and adults' emotions and responses, and some, as you've said, everyday, and Justine said, fairly typical situations. So thank you so much. To our early childhood seminar audience, if you want to share or to revisit this presentation, it will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. As I mentioned, this is the final in this year's series, so we would like to note our immense thanks to the faculty's communications and marketing team for all their support for this series. We will be in touch with you all soon to plan for 2023. And I'd just like to finish with a whakatauki. Hapaitia te ara tika pumo ai te rangatiratanga mō ngā uri whakatipu. Foster the pathway of knowledge to strength, independence and growth for future generations. Hei kona mai, goodbye for now.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Justine.